All right, so let's get into this last part. Okay, so this is our last video in the 4. And so let's move into situational appropriateness. So this is that 4th component, and they align 1.3 behavioral expectations to situational appropriateness. We know what behavioral expectations are, right? Creating that set of school-wide expectations, but the elaboration states that teams adopt or revise the expectations that are reflective of the cultural values of the community. They're identified based on the purpose within the setting, as opposed to simply the school tradition or whatever the status quo might be. And within this culturally responsive framework, expectations should focus on high standards for all students, but be able to be taught and learned and be respectful of students' cultures. The next feature they align to situational appropriateness is 1.4, teaching expectations. So the active and explicit teaching of our school-wide expectations, right? We know what this is. We go around, we ask if our teachers have taught the expectations, if our kids know the expectations. The elaboration explains that teams ensure that school staff understand that all students need this teaching about expected behaviors, and that we have a process and procedures for doing that, right? Regardless of what previous learning and without disrespecting families' beliefs. And when we see that expectations differ between the home and community environment and the school environment, staff explicitly teach those differences, which is that code switching. They teach also the purpose of having the expectation at school and providing that additional practice until students demonstrate that fluency, right? So we always talk about that. And then 1.5, problem behavior definitions, is aligned with situational appropriateness as well. We know this is that classroom versus office T-chart as well as the flow chart. But what is this? According to Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide, the teams and school staff understand the difference between universally unacceptable and situationally inappropriate behaviors, right? So what do we know is appropriate for school? And then take responsibility for teaching what is wanted at school without devaluing that what's acceptable possibly in the home and community environment. Behaviors that are established as unacceptable at school must be grounded in some actual purpose. For example, keeping students safe, right? And then when there's differences between school and home community, definitions of those unacceptable or undesirable behaviors, they're discussed and mitigated with families and communities so that schools truly reflect the communities they serve. So this is that point where families are involved, right? And students are involved. So we talk about those expectations. We have explicit conversations about whether these expectations are similar to what's expected outside of school. And if not, how do we help students to be able to, follow those expectations in the school environment if that is not what they normally follow when they're not at school, if that's not already their accepted expectations that their behavior is guided by. So let's think here in the next discussion question. Consider this phrase: within a culturally responsive framework, behavior expectations should focus on high standards for all students, be able to be taught and learned, and be respectful of the students' cultures. And so let's review the school-wide matrix of one of our cohort 5 high schools. You could take another one if you'd like, but let's possibly look at a high school, right? One of our new ones coming on. Do you believe that it meets this standard in this phrase above? All right, let's look at the last component, data for equity. So of course, these are those last 4 features of the TFI that they align with data for equity. So they start with 112, discipline data, having access to that data, right? We know what this means. But the elaboration states that teams regularly disaggregate that discipline data in order to monitor equity, right? And that we're purposeful in examining that inequitable outcome data first from that systems perspective before we view it as a specific individual student or family issue. Okay, so they align 113 as well, database decision-making to data for equity. We know this is that data-informed decision-making that teams engage in. But that in the elaboration, there's a specific focus on equity. We take responsibility for the outcomes of each student, regardless of their circumstances, and that we examine those inequitable outcomes from a systems perspective before we, once again, consider individual behavior support. So looking at those systems, those policies, those practices. 114, fidelity data, right? We assess fidelity of implementation. We know what this is. Most of our schools get 2s in this area because we conduct this fidelity data and this assessment. But the elaboration states that teams, staff, and stakeholders committed to enhancing PBIS implementation with culturally responsive components. So we don't just look at the TFI, right, to assess our implementation. We look at some of these components to assess whether we're being culturally responsive in our implementation of PBIS. So maybe we don't just use the TFI to assess it. We actually look at some of these pieces and we include our families and students in this process. So maybe it's not just us as coaches with a few team members going around and doing the walkthrough. Maybe this is involving our families. Maybe our families will actually walk through the school and be involved in our walkthroughs or looking at some of these PBIS implementation components. Maybe students are involved as well on a high school level also. So thinking about some out-of-the-box ways for us to engage in fidelity assessment that's outside of just looking at the TFI and coaches walking around with team members. So this is something we can be thinking about as we move into the future. 115, annual evaluation. We understand this. We compare our year-to-year implementation to look at fidelity and effectiveness, but the elaboration states that school staff understand that schools play a critical role as we're accountable to our communities, and that obviously this annual evaluation procedure engages our stakeholders in two-way communication regarding goals and progress. So this is that piece we're always trying to grow here, right? So we involve our stakeholders so that we can have them to inform some of what we need to do differently as we move forward with PBIS implementation. And that last feature, 114, kind of hinges on this one as well. So how are we involving our stakeholders in actually assessing implementation and fidelity? And then once we do that, how do we involve them in setting goals to improve implementation moving forward? How are they involved? So each of these pieces of cultural responsiveness kind of connect with each other, right? From the implementation from the beginning of involving their voice in the process to really pulling in and involving them not only in the process, but in assessing how effective we are in implementation. So let's look and discuss in this next question with each other. Let's share. PBIS.org published another brief which provides an overview for teams to guide data-informed decision making. It includes steps for problem analysis when responding to disproportionate data. Right, so this brief is linked right below this video in Schoology. So you can look there. It's also linked in the slides as well. And it really provides a specific guide for teams to look at disproportionality. And it provides some specific steps on page 10. So let's review page 10 of the brief and let's share together our thoughts on our capacity to lead this process with PBIS teams, specifically in reference to the steps listed on page 10. So let's share with each other after you get a chance to read page 10 what our thoughts are on how comfortable, what our capacity is as coaches to be able to guide this process and engage in those steps shared on page 10. All right, so let's look at our next steps in discussion thread 19. There are a lot of discussions here, a lot of sharing, but in this discussion here, let's look at our next steps. What can they be? So I'm just going to share some thoughts I had initially. One thought is obviously that data review. So let's cross-check our school fidelity scores with disaggregated discipline data. We might have to wait a little bit to do this, just because the data dashboard will be ready for coaches to get access to when you all return in August or late July. You'll have a chance to access your school's data and really compare your fidelity with their outcome data. But also professional learning. How might this information be shared with school teams? What might be the most effective way to do that? What would be the goal of sharing this information with school teams? And so that's one piece I've been thinking about as well. And then what do you think? What do we all think as a team? What do you think could be some next steps that could help inform how this information could support our schools as they implement PBIS in a culturally responsive manner? Okay, and our last quote here, I'm just going to bring us back to what we shared in the beginning. Because contextual fit is a core principle of school-wide PBIS is not fully implemented until it is culturally responsive. So this is something that I was left with. I just thought this meant quite a bit in reflecting on this particular quote by Maya Angelou, when you know better, you do better. And I feel like moving through these videos together as a team helps us to really deepen our understanding of what what implementation of PBIS looks like when we are being culturally responsive in working with our schools. And so I know that we have to gain this knowledge. We have to reflect as a team and think about how we can inform our work and our support of our teams to really move this process along in Virginia Beach. And our reach is quite wide with all of the schools we support. And our capacity is great for being able to inform some of these pieces moving forward. But here, in our last piece, I'd love in the last discussion, discussion 20, for us to share some resources with each other. And so I have shared some resources of my own that I think are important for us to think about and reflect around in the last discussion thread 20. I've shared some links to some articles that I think are important for us to think about and read about. And I'd love to see what articles and what maybe even videos you would like to share that you think would be important for us to look at, to read through, to deepen our knowledge as well. And so this is just an ability, a time, for us to really share with each other and build our awareness and our capacity for this work. So I'm glad we've been able to do this together, and I hope it helps us to move this work forward in a meaningful way.